Honourable Member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I begin my speech on the topic of shipwrecks and derelict vessels with cannibal rats. More specifically, Canadian cannibal rats. That should get everyone's attention, Mr. Speaker. Not every day Canadian cannibal rats make it to a speech in this honourable House. Now, how is this for a headline, Mr. Speaker? Ghost ship crewed only by cannibal rats feared to be heading for Scottish coast. Now, that's from the Scottish Daily Record. Or this headline, Mr. Speaker, from the Plymouth Herald. Ghost ship full of cannibal rats could be about to crash into Devon coast. Finally, Mr. Speaker, hedging its bets, thisiscornwall.com declared ghost ship full of diseased cannibal rats could crash into the coast of Devon or Cornwall. Now, Mr. Speaker, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are known far and wide as the friendliest people on the planet. But sending a ghost ship full of cannibal diseased rats across the North Atlantic is no way to treat your European neighbors. We're better than that, Mr. Speaker. Now, the ghost ship crewed by cannibal rats was the Lyubov Orlova, a 38-year-old, 4,250-ton Russian cruise ship that was tied up, Mr. Speaker, in St. John's Harbor for 2 years. Now, it was tied up for 2 years, Mr. Speaker, after it was apprehended by the RCMP after a financial scandal involving the boat's European owners. Now, the ship, Mr. Speaker, it was an eyesore. It was a rusty, dirty smudge on the St. John's waterfront for months. Nothing, apparently, could be done about it, Mr. Speaker. Then, finally, Mr. Speaker, in January 2011, the Orlova was being towed, finally, to the Dominican Republic, where it was to have been taken apart for scrap. Mr. Speaker, the ship was only out of St. John's Harbor for a day when the tow line broke. Now, in the words of our then Transport Canada critic Olivia Chow, Transport Canada should have never given a license to allow an unreliable and unsafe tugboat to tug the Orlova in the first place. But that's another story, Mr. Speaker. The ship drifted for a week towards offshore oil platforms on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and that was a real risk, Mr. Speaker, before it was towed clear by an offshore supply boat. Now, the Orlova was then towed by a vessel hired by Transport Canada, but that tow line, Mr. Speaker, that tow line also broke. And the ship, Mr. Speaker, full of Canadian cannibal rats, if you believe the headlines, Mr. Speaker, drifted into international waters where it made international headlines for the threat that it was to the Scottish and Irish coasts, in that it could crash into those coasts, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the ship eventually sank, or that's the widespread belief, Mr. Speaker. Keep in mind that it's a ghost ship. Now, the story of the Orlova is a bizarre one, Mr. Speaker. The story of the Orlova comes across as a Canadian joke, but it's not funny, Mr. Speaker. Far from it. The Orlova was an eyesore in St. John's Harbor for months and months and months. The ship was a threat to our offshore oil platforms, a threat to shipping. The ship was a threat to the British coast. Which brings us, Mr. Speaker, to this private member's bill, Bill C-638, an act to amend the Canada Shipping Act 2001, which my party supports, Mr. Speaker. If this bill were in effect when the Orlova was still around, Mr. Speaker, the world could have been spared the suspense of where the transatlantic cannibal rat ship from Newfoundland and Labrador from Canada would end up. This bill would give the Canadian Coast Guard the regulatory power it needs to take action before a derelict vessel becomes a problem. And that example is a perfect example, Mr. Speaker, of why the Canadian Coast Guard needs to be given that power. Mr. Speaker, derelict vessels are a growing problem across Canada, as has already been pointed out, with the aging of both industrial and pleasure craft. In 2013, the Canadian Boating Association estimated that there were 4.3 million boats in Canada. Now, the number of derelict and abandoned vessels was pegged at 240 in November 2012, with the majority of those boats, Mr. Speaker, on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Normally, Mr. Speaker, only a vessel that is in an immediate hazard to navigation or the environment will be dealt with by any level of government. That leaves derelict vessels like the Orlova in a gray zone, Mr. Speaker. No one is responsible for preventing them from deteriorating and becoming a problem. No one is responsible, Mr. Speaker. This bill will designate the Canadian Coast Guard as the receiver of a wreck for the purposes of the Canadian Shipping Act, allowing the Coast Guard to take action without being directed by a ministry. It will compel the government, Mr. Speaker, to create regulations for the removal, disposition, and destruction of derelict vessels or wrecks. Now, Mr. Speaker, giving the Canadian Coast Guard the authority to deal with derelict vessels is only a first step. Now, the honourable member for Nanaimo-Cowichan, who tabled this bill, and a fine member she is, Mr. Speaker, she wanted to create a derelict vessel removal regime similar to that in Washington State, Mr. Speaker. There, a fee on the annual vessel registration helps pay for the costs of removal of derelict vessels, and a single public agency, the Department of Natural Resources, is responsible for administering that program. But that was beyond the scope of a private member's bill, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we have this first step, a private member's bill that gives the Canadian Coast Guard the power to take action before a derelict vessel becomes a problem. Makes sense, Mr. Speaker. Now, to elaborate on what happens in Washington State, the Abandoned and Derelict Vessels program there has been in place, Mr. Speaker, for 10 years and resulted in the remediation of roughly 500 vessels. Now, there are signs we may be headed in that direction, Mr. Speaker, although you wouldn't say it if you listened to the speech from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Transport Minister. Let me quote, though, from a letter that his minister wrote to the member for Nanaimo-Cowichan. In that recent letter, Mr. Speaker, she stated Transport Canada will, quote, further analyze wider policy options related to derelict, abandoned, and wrecked vessels, including legal authorities and governance models. Mr. Speaker, that shows a sign of hope. My party will be keeping an eye on that to make sure that there's follow-through. Mr. Speaker, I also have an example of an abandoned vessel in the waters off Newfoundland's northeast coast that's been an environmental hazard for years, Mr. Speaker, that has been leaking oil into the waters off Newfoundland's northeast coast for years. And this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, has failed to date to fix the problem permanently, Mr. Speaker. The Manolis L, a paper carrier, sank 30 years ago this year in the waters off Notre Dame Bay with 500 tons of fuel aboard, Mr. Speaker. Now, the wreck sat dormant for years, but a powerful storm 2 years ago dislodged the vessel. That storm also dislodged the 500 tons of fuel that were in the vessel's hull. Now, last year, the Canadian Coast Guard replaced a cofferdam. That's a device that catches leaking oil. It replaced a cofferdam in order to stop the fuel leak. But that's not a permanent solution, Mr. Speaker. Not at all. Oil-covered ducks and other animals have been discovered in the oil, and with eastern Canada's largest seabird colony just 100 kilometers away, Mr. Speaker, people are worried, and rightly so, Mr. Speaker. So they should be. In the words of local resident David Boyd, quote, the patient is slowly bleeding out, and we're putting a Band-Aid on it rather than going in and doing the operation that needs to be done, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the operation that needs to be done is the removal of that oil. Mr. Speaker, there is no consistency in this country when it comes to derelict vessels, when it comes to shipwrecks. A couple of years ago, the Canadian Coast Guard launched a major operation to extract hundreds of tons of fuel from a U.S. Army transport ship that sank in 1946 off British Columbia's remote north coast. No consistency, Mr. Speaker. The oil aboard the Manolis L off Newfoundland and Labrador's northeast coast has not been cleaned up. But it must be cleaned up, Mr. Speaker, permanently. Why would they clean up a wreck off the BC coast and not clean up a wreck off Newfoundland and Labrador's coast, Mr. Speaker? First things first, though, Mr. Speaker. Let's pass this bill and give the Coast Guard the regulatory power it needs before a derelict vessel becomes a problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable